Reliably calculating developer productivity has been almost a holy grail for people involved in any sort of management work or transformation work. We're doing a lot of things to simplify a system, we're trying to coach, we're trying to give better tools, better education, and we want a way to be able to show that there actually have been improvements. Let me warn you now, velocity is a tempting path, and it is not the way. Velocity is very easy to measure. You have teams that calculate some kind of points of work that they're going to bring in, and you can see what they completed, and you can start to get an average of how many points they're completing per iteration. And things that are easy to capture and easy to measure are often misused. Now, wanting to see that are you having an impact on the system is a worthy goal. Wanting to see if you've made people more productive, even just as an activity focus, is perfectly reasonable. You want to see, okay, am I increasing throughput through the system? Velocity, however, is not a measure of throughput. Let's talk about why. Velocity is traditionally based on story points, and story points are a technique for relative estimation. And relative estimation, what we're doing is looking at two things and saying this one is bigger than the other. This one is twice as big as the other. This is 8 times as big as the other one. And that allows us to quickly make gut check decisions as we look at items that have a lot of hidden complexity in them. We're pretty bad as humans at estimating anything beyond trivial work. So story points give us a way to take ourselves out of that, take a look at something and try to make an educated guess about, is this bigger than a bread box? That then lets teams judge capacity. So in Scrum, a sprint is time boxed, and that time box is sacred. It stops and it starts, and the next one starts, and then it finishes, and then the next one starts. And we maintain that cadence. And that time box then allows us to have these short little pieces of time where we focus on something, try to limit our work in progress, and try to get it to done before we pull on the next thing. It also gives us a cadence for regular reflection. What's important about the use of story points as a secondary technique and the use of velocity is it helps us figure out as a team how much work do we think we can pull in so that we don't accidentally vastly overcommit and a little less risky undercommit. It's a gut check so that when we protect that time box, we have a chance of finishing what we started. It also forces us to take a hard look at things that are planned on long time horizons and say, is this even possible? So we may want this thing by third quarter, but looking at it, it's gigantic and we need to split it before we can make a good decision about that. All of that stuff is wonderful. We finally have a way of making some educated empirical decisions about what it is we can bring in. However, all those numbers are wrong. They just are. Now, Scrum accepts that they're wrong, and there's ways of dealing with that and ways of dealing if you over or under committed. The expectation is that they are incorrect. That's why we do relative estimation. That's why we don't estimate in hours. That's also why teams can renegotiate sprint scope with their product owners. Those numbers are incorrect. They just are because they are predictive, and we have no idea if there's a hidden complexity in here, if there's variability we didn't account for, if when we get into the code, it's much harder to make that change than we expected. And because of that, the number coming out the other side of your sprint, what you completed, is not an actual output metric. It's not a productivity metric. It's entirely relying on that kind of predictive estimate of how big this thing was. You could have put 107 on something that really, when you went and built it, was a 2. So if you're using the actual velocity of a team and trying to look at that as a predictive metric of their productivity, you're going to be off. Those numbers are actually not correlated. What can happen instead? So once you start using those numbers and say comparing two teams' velocities or saying that you need to increase them by a certain amount or really putting pressure on that number, well, what happens with any number you put pressure on? It gets gamed. Velocity is remarkably easy to game quite on purpose. Relative estimation is a floating scale. So because we're comparing two things, it doesn't really matter what number was on this one. We just know that this one's twice as hard, so it should be twice as big. That floating scale allows those estimates to float with the team as they gain maturity, float with the application as it gets more or less complex, without having to rebase your estimates all the time. They migrate over time. So if you put pressure on velocity, it just speeds up the migration. So now what would have been a 2 is a 4, what would have been a 4 is an 8, what would have been an 8 is 107. And of course it is, because the teams are going to keep trying to make sure that they are off the naughty list. Everybody knows that. We try to counteract that in various ways. There is another problem with using velocity as your primary productivity metric, it is meant to float, which means you cannot and should not standardize it. If it becomes anchored to something that is not something that has complexity, so if it becomes anchored to an hour, a day, even a single item that too big of a group shares that don't know a lot about it, you've given up all the benefits of a floating estimation scale with comparisons, and now you've gone back to what would have been estimates in hours, where it becomes far too concrete for it to be useful. And now those estimates start to become expensive because people are going to spend a lot of time because they know they're going to be held accountable to them, trying to make sure that they're correct. Here is another problem. When we explain all this to you and you're saying, okay, well, we know the estimates were wrong, so and we know at the end of sprints, a lot of times you don't end up actually completing what you said you did, or maybe you learned, like I said earlier, that a 2 was actually an 8 or a 32 was actually a 1. Well, shouldn't we go back and re-estimate then? Because then we can actually go back and change those estimates to what actually reflected reality. Or should we track hours then and see how big these were and then adjust our estimates to match the hours? That is expensive. That is all waste. So you remember originally used velocity as a productivity metric because it was pretty cheap and easy. You were already doing it. Teams should already be doing it. Well, now we've added another measure, another metric of productivity on the ends of things where you want teams to go back and re-estimate work that was already completed. For what benefit? Doesn't help them gauge capacity, doesn't help them actually deliver more or learn more. It might make them slightly better estimators if they regularly reflect back at how big things actually were. But that's a pretty expensive ask for something as minor as that kind of an update. So what do we do instead? I'm wondering why we needed to understand developer productivity to begin with, and if that's really the thing we're looking at. We very rarely look at any other role's productivity in software engineering. A manager's productivity, a project manager's productivity, the CEO's productivity. No one is tracking how they're actually producing or how much value or how much output they're actually giving out there. Everything gets aimed back at developers and what they're putting out there. If we can survive without productivity metrics for those other roles, I think we might be able to survive without productivity metrics for developers. And instead, we can start looking at meta information at more of a global system level, looking at the individual developer level or even the team level. Something like velocity is a microscope view. Instead, we should start looking at value output at the product level, at the whole system level. We can start looking at tracers of throughput. So starting looking at cycle time. So put a tracer through your system, measure how long it takes to get out the other side. See, can we put something similar through and what does that take? Can we shorten that loop from end to end? Starting to look at how work gets delivered, what value is coming back from the system. And especially if you can reach a stable state with your teams where you're less worried about tuning up and turning down budget, hiring more developers, firing old ones. You can say, here are 30 teams for this product. This is what they do. And they deliver in a steady cadence. Now you can plan on that cadence. Now you can actually look forward into the future and see what you can deliver. And now you can start comparing value output because you know the cadence is steady. So remember, the Agile Manifesto does not say that teams should attain an ever-increasing pace, an ever-increasing accelerating velocity. It says they should attain a sustainable pace. So we don't want to push teams to increase. We don't want to push teams to rapidly try to outpace whatever they delivered the last time. We want them to reach a cadence that they can live with for the rest of their lives and continually get better at. And as they grow, they might take on more complex items. And as they do that, they might find that those problems are harder and they take longer to solve. This is all healthy and good, but we keep falling back on the velocity trap. The more pressure we put on it, the less likely it is to be accurate. The less likely it is to be accurate, the less useful it is. And it is so useful for teams that are using this of their own free will in a really healthy way to help make some good decisions about what it is they think they can take on and to make sure they've wrung out all the manipulatable variability out of that. So please, 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 for the maybe 300th time, from the 300th Agile person who said it, please at least think twice about using velocity outside the team for anything else that is not about the team planning capacity or the product owner really understanding what their product level capacity is. Please don't use it for anything else. That's not what it's for. We're going to end up corrupting its primary use. Let's be creative and find other ways of looking at the problems we're trying to solve without always maybe looking directly at the developers themselves.